So it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Paddy Gleeson. I'm sure a lot of you are very, very familiar with Paddy, so I won't go through great lengthy introductions, other than to say that Paddy's a senior lecturer here at Queen's for early medieval archaeology, PhD supervisor. His interests are really late prehistoric, medieval, and historical archaeology of Europe. He's a member of many august institutions, such as the Young Academy of Ireland, Royal House Academy, Historic Monuments Council of Northern Ireland, and Standing Committee for Archaeology of the RIA as well. His current research is focusing on the archaeology of cult, rulership, kingdoms, and governance in the first millennium. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Paddy back. He's always a great speaker, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Paddy.
Thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much for the invitation to speak. It's always nice to get to speak somewhere that you teach and that you work, and particularly to get to do it in something that you actually care about and like, which is quite a luxury for me in this line of work. But particularly, I suppose, what I was asked to speak and was very grateful for is my not so new book. Given that it probably took me about 10 years to finish writing this book and get it published, it's new to me, and it will be for a number of years. But it's published in August, and I suppose ultimately what I'm going to talk about is I suppose the ideas in that book, and I suppose its aims really. And given that when I was doing the back cover of the book and the publishers asked me to kind of one line, what's the book about, I really struggled to come up with one thing that the book argues, and I think that'll be clear as we go through this. But really, I suppose this is a study about the institution of kingship and how it developed through a series of case studies that are sort of situated within wider context. And in essence, I suppose what its sort of picture, its aim is to look at the institution of kingship in Ireland within its broader international context. And so while I won't dwell too much on the kind of international parallels or talk about Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon kingship, I think that context is certainly some of the ways in which, certainly context for some of the ways in which I've developed ideas, or how I'll sort of spin through some of the next slides. So I suppose my starting point always with any sort of study like this is the problems associated with the study of kingship in later prehistoric and medieval Ireland. So while I'm principally interested in this book in early medieval Ireland, ultimately I suppose its later prehistoric relationship is equally important. But for the study of the early medieval period, that relationship is actually quite problematic, because it comes with a whole host of historiographical baggage that has shaped the way we've thought about and studied and written about this institution in the early medieval period, and indeed how Ireland is seen nationally and internationally by scholars in Scandinavia, on the continent, or in other medieval studies anywhere else. And so the first couple of slides, I'm really going to explore some of the problems and some of the sort of knock-on effects of those problems, and then proceed into some of the case studies to think about the ways in which we can look at an archaeological dimension to kingship and what that might mean. The key point really, I suppose, of this slide is to highlight one kind of Leviathan-like aspect of the wider study, and that is the looming presence of a fivefold provincial division of the island of Ireland, which since probably at least the 8th century AD has been taken to be a relative given in terms of an idea of Ireland being divided into 5 provinces since time immemorial, each of which province would have a nascent provincial capital, and then at the seat of a kind of kingship of all of Ireland controlling the island of Ireland. This is an idea that goes back at least to the 8th century in terms of kind of the literati of the period. Nevertheless, from my perspective, and not to give away the kind of the overall finding, is that there's no evidence for this. There's no evidence for any sort of provincial divisions of the island of Ireland before around about the 7th, at the very earliest, but particularly the 8th and 9th centuries. And for me, the creation of an idea of provinces and of the provincial centres being the capitals of provinces really comes from their political importance and the roles that they played for the local polities who gained regional ascendance in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries AD. So I suppose that's a slightly different view to maybe some more recent scholarship, but it's one that I suppose gives a bit of sense of the context within which my study is conducted, and I suppose some of the biases that might be inherent in how I approach the subject too. On the right-hand side, we have, I suppose, a representation of Ptolemy's Cosmographia, I suppose map in inverted commas of the island of Ireland. And I show this to highlight 2 kind of key features. And the first one is that Ptolemy refers to different regia on the island of Ireland. Now, there's only 2 regia, 2 royal sites, in terms of one in the north that perhaps could be somewhere like Macha, one in the south that could be somewhere like Knockany, which I'll come on to in a few slides. But outside of that illustration of the institution of kingship existing because royal places existed in the 1st century AD, one of the things that strikes me about this source is that it has a whole host of different polity names and group names that are important and have gotten back to Ptolemy, wherever he's writing, and some of those might be related to historic periods, but the vast majority are not. So those polities were not immutable. They were transient, and they fail to exist once we get into the historic era of the 6th or 7th centuries. And that should remind us of the flux and dynamism of the island of Ireland in this period. When it comes to the wider context of how we study kingship in that kind of later prehistoric twilight, I suppose, one of the key ways in which we've tended to approach that institution, at least from an archaeological perspective, is through the prism of ceremony and ideology. And there's been lots of very nuanced and very important studies about the relationship between the institution of kingship and Indo-European inheritances in terms of similarities between early Irish kingship ideology and Vedic India, all of which are valid and intensely important, as for instance, the study by Charles Doherty in relation to the similarities between Irish inauguration rituals for paramount kings at places like Tara and the Ashmavedva ritual for a paramount king in 7th century Vedic India. And underlying this ceremony and ideology is ideas of a king as a mediator between his people and the other world, as the kind of supernatural force that unites the realm, and his success being mirrored in the landscape and its kind of ecological dimensions too. And the idea of the king being married to a consort or sovereignty goddess that is expressed through the Banish Ríg, the marriage feast of kingship. And all of these ideas are valid, and all of these ideas are well trodden in scholarship. But for me, what this does in terms of understanding early medieval Ireland and understanding the institution of kingship in Ireland is to sideline the politics and governance aspects of how kingdoms were formed and how they were governed and brought together. And actually, for me, that's more interesting. It's really more interesting for me in terms of my interest and my expertise to think about power and to think about how politics operates through power. So while there's nothing wrong with ceremony and ideology as a focus of study, and there's certainly lots of interesting things we can say about it, it doesn't really, for me, give us an insight into essentially how kingdoms worked. And that's one of the things I was interested in with this study. The other sort of side to that coin in terms of the big issues, or kind of related to that big issue, is on the one hand, this kind of marginalization of politics and power in how we study kingship in Ireland. And the other is, I suppose, the wider theoretical framework within which we tend to study power and politics more generally across Northwestern Europe, or indeed in many societies around the world. And that's the structure of state formation, essentially an analytical and interpretive framework that's used the world over to look at complexity in societies and how societies evolve towards complexity. And while, again, there's a huge scholarship around this and its importance and different models and ideas of how we might approach it, ultimately most scholars and critiques agree that state formation as a framework is deeply nationalistic. It encourages people to look at the evidence that they're concerned with within kind of myopic national traditions. We won't call them nationalistic traditions, perhaps, but definitely within national traditions and modern national boundaries. And it's also evolutionary. So it creates a structure by which societies progress towards complexity from kind of, band level society all the way up to statehood, assuming that statehood for many societies, if not universal, is the kind of desired ambition. But yet there's scholars like Pierre Clastres who encourage us to appreciate that societies can reject statehood and they can be complex without necessarily being state level. So for me, the critiques of people like Adam Smith around state formation in the kind of Bronze Age setting are equally as apt for the medieval period. And these tend to try and encourage us to reframe analysis around things like sovereignty and authority, where the nexus of power and identity is constantly negotiated. And I think one of the key differences between how Adam Smith and others conceptualize these issues is to see the key point of an analytical imperative actually being around the relationship between regimes and communities. It's about the relationship between those that govern and those that are governed, and there's agency going in two different directions. The kind of analytical dimension to how that idea pans out is really to kind of move authority away from something that has a universal immanence in terms of people's daily lives and how politics and power might operate, to actually seeing authority as something that's a kind of an archipelago, almost like the Gulag archipelago of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel, if we want to call it that, about the gulags of Stalinist Russia, where ultimately there can be islands of power where politics are negotiated, but they can be fused into kind of one continent and one nation through the strategies of rulership and governance that polities employ. And particularly important for that is, for that kind of, I suppose, theoretical critique, is the fact that with state formation, we tend to deny complexity to polities in, say, the 4th, 5th, or 6th centuries in a Roman European context, or indeed in Scandinavian context. And actually, when we look at the evidence that we have equally as good evidence that in the 5th and 6th centuries in Ireland and Britain and other polities, we have equally complex regional polities existing in the archaeological record, but we tend to ignore them because we have this kind of evolutionary narrative for how things emerge. For instance, in Ireland, in the 5th century AD, we have reference to 3 different types or grades of kings within the writings of St. Patrick in his Confessio. It refers to 2 minor grades of kings and then kings who adjudicate throughout the regions, qui judicanbat per omnes regiones. And Donnchadh Corona suggested very reasonably that that approximates to the level of a sort of provincial king that we get in the status tracts much later. So I suppose for me, starting off with the jargon, as Tom McKerlin was speaking to me a few minutes ago, but this is important because I think this is an aspect of a very important element of how we can reframe archaeological analysis and think about kingdoms and how they work in medieval Ireland very differently. But it's also important to do because on the one hand, state formation, but also the exceptionalism that we've tended to approach the study of medieval Ireland and later prehistoric Ireland within has created a sense within European scholarship where actually Ireland isn't very interesting, or at least it's just not very relevant. And if it is interesting, it's because it's kind of outlandish and different. So these are just a very small selection of some pieces of scholarship, and not critiquing the scholars themselves, but just highlighting, I suppose, in my view, the ways in which these wider issues and aspects have tended to colour the way we see early medieval Ireland, particularly the institution of kingship. So Richard Hodges, in his very famous Dark Age economics book, refers to Ireland and Scotland as an abortive civilization, a place where there's an aboriginal level of material culture. I'm sure material culture specialists in the room would tend to disagree with that. Andrew Reynolds, in a very recent paper, is talking about royal sites in Ireland and Western and Northern Britain as kind of islands of paranoia and insecurity in the landscape. Again, very kind of negative connotations here. And then even in Chris Wickham's magisterial frame in the early Middle Ages, he talks about a peasant mode economy in Ireland, where Ireland is the least politically developed region of Europe. And none of this rings true for me in terms of my understanding of the evidence and my view of early medieval Ireland. There's reasons why scholarship sees this as being the case, and it really comes back to the complexity of the evidence that we have. But for me, the reasons are actually to do with the richness of the evidence that we have for medieval Ireland by comparison to continental Europe or Anglo-Saxon regions, and the historiography of how that's been handled in the last 150, 180 years, namely a nationalistic tradition by and large, and a tradition that sort of basks in a redundant exceptionalism, even in more modern scholarship. So one of the most famous studies of I suppose Irish kingship, for want of a better term, is Daniel Binchie's, where he refers to it as society as being tribal, rural, hierarchical, familiar. And while all of those are apt descriptions of the society from one perspective, they don't really serve to place that framework with that analysis within a framework that we can relate to polities elsewhere. And that's kind of one of the things that I want to do. So I think the foil for this is to think about what kingdoms are, to think about how kingship works, because of course, if we have kingdoms, we must have kingship. And we tend to think about kingdoms in medieval Ireland as something like this on the screen, where, for instance, in the Kingdom of Midge, we have the 2 principal constituent units of Cloncolman and Síl-Néad-Sláine, and that the territories that make up those large regional kingdoms are essentially block territorial entities. Whereas for me, I would suggest that we should think of kingdoms as actually systems of relationships, inter- and interpolity relationships that are hierarchically constituted, but are dynamic in terms of the personal aspects of those relationships changing through time. And one of the reasons for that is to account for the extraordinarily high numbers of kingdoms that we have in early medieval Ireland. So Francis John Byrne famously opened his book, Irish Kings and High Kings, with the adage that many Irishmen boast descent from kings. And he's not wrong, because probably at any one point in time in the early medieval period, we can point to hundreds and hundreds of kingdoms that existed simultaneously. There's a famous number of 185 often quoted for early medieval Ireland, but actually that's just the 11th and 12th century tricoccades, military muster and taxation units of the 11th to 12th centuries. If we look just at the Kingdom of Midge that we have from the previous slide, these are probably the territorial extents of the constituent kingdoms of the Kingdom of Midge in and around the 8th century AD. This isn't to say what they look like in the 5th century or in the 9th or 10th centuries, but it really shows the complexity of local identity. and the fact that even the most vagrant lineage and kingdom could retain some aspect of kingship. And this is why European scholarship tends to see Ireland as being a bit of a backwater and a place where kingship is very local in terms of its importance. And of course it is, but that localness doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an element of regionality and there isn't an element of larger scale power and power structures that we can use to look at kind of wider frameworks and similarities. So one way to think about how we might approach that archaeologically is to think about the different site types that we might encounter in the sense of the archaeological record. And this is just one example from the North Coast to highlight that when we speak of any kingdom, even if it's the 600 kingdoms that we might hypothesize in early medieval Ireland, in all cases, they probably had more than one royal site, because a royal site is, of course, a generic term that scholarship has created. And for the vast majority of kingdoms we can hypothesize in the early medieval period, they probably had at least 3 different foci of royal power. And one would be a caput, a place where a king would reside. One would be a place that might be associated with inauguration or the enkingment of people, maybe slightly different things there. And then one would be associated with assembly. And scholarship in Ireland has tended to roll assembly and inauguration into the same sort of bundle and essentially, I suppose, treat them together in a generic category. And I think actually that includes the complexity of practices associated with them, but also creates a bit of a non-category, a kind of a generic assembly category. There's actually only 2 places recorded in early medieval Ireland that are associated with inauguration per se, and that's actually the Rock of Cashel and the Hill of Tara. That doesn't mean that they're the only places associated with inauguration, but they're actually the only ones that we have explicit evidence for the making of a king at those places in the early medieval period. So even in the case of this royal estate, presumably from the North Coast associated with the Kingdom of Dál Riata, we have the royal caput at somewhere like Dunseverick. Then we perhaps have a place that might be associated with inauguration, and might is doing some heavy lifting there in terms of Cruachmore, where there might be a cairn associated with the enkingment of the local ruler. And then we also probably have an assembly site, perhaps somewhere along the coast near White Park Bay at Downach-Canry, near Ballintoy, or somewhere in that vague region around Knocksogie, overlooking the headland there. So the key point here is that in any even minor scale of kingdom, we have multiple foci of royal power and identity. And we've tended really to fixate on the major royal sites, or maybe just places associated with inauguration, see them as kind of being this generic category. So if we come back to the idea of 600 assemblies, or sorry, 600 kingdoms, that implies 600 caputs, 600 assemblies, 600 places of enkingment, whatever we might want to call it. And it's no exaggeration then to say that actually kingship is at once the central institution of early Irish society, but also the core problem for understanding that society and trying to bring forward our understanding of its wider social setting and context. So if we take just assembly to start off with and think about how we might approach assembly from an archaeological perspective, I did some work over a number of years to try and identify an archaeological character to assembly practices. And by and large, while there's only really maybe 10 or 12 assembly sites per se, or places associated with Éanach or Éanig that have ever been identified and studied archaeologically, there's at least 78 documented. And actually, we can probably say there's at least 600 that would have existed at any one point in time. So we're obviously missing an awful lot of complexity. Now, I was able to assemble a database of around about 120 assembly landscapes and look at their general characteristics and look at the features associated with them materially, spatially, in a landscape setting. And I suppose once we start to look at the historical and documentary sources for what types of activities are associated with those sites, Éanig were venues for redistributing tribute. They were places where people brought together tribute to be paid to their ruler and then redistributed or stored in a ruler's residence and royal estate. They were places where law courts happened. They were also places where feasting, entertainment, and horse and chariot racing happened. So they're kind of, they're the social glue of society in many ways, but they've been very, very poorly studied. And one thing we can say for certain from that survey work was that there is a direct relationship between places of burial in early medieval Ireland and places of assembly. And I won't go into too much detail in that. I'll just illustrate this through a couple of very brief case studies. So firstly, to look at the landscape around Dunalnia. This is, of course, the capital of the province of Leinster in terms of that provincial division of the island of Ireland. But actually, for me, more interesting is the fact that just a couple of kilometres across the River Liffey is a royal estate identified by Paul McCotter, which is the royal estate for the assembly place of Éanach Carman. And Éanach Carman is the assembly place of the province of Leinster. So for me, again, going back to that pattern at Dunseverick on the North Coast, it's not coincidental that the ceremonial capital of a province of Leinster and the assembly place of a province of Leinster are within a couple of kilometres of each other. But the first thing to note is the scale of the estate associated with that assembly landscape. This has been identified by Paul and studied through his kind of revolutionary methodologies. And indeed, around the boundaries of that estate, there's at least 5 or 6 different burial places of the early medieval period. There's Green Hills in Corbally, which we can see on the bottom of the screen, and the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Also burials at Coughlinstown and Mullacash. And actually, in at least 3 of those cases, these burial places are actually documented in the genealogies of the dynasties of Leinster, where they're actually mentioned as the local caputs of some of the local dynasties of the Iberca, the Dalmas and Corb. So I think what this tells me is both that this is an assembly place in the 5th to 7th centuries AD when the cemeteries are in use, but also that the cemeteries and the burial rite that they describe are being used as a new form of monumentality at that point to demarcate this assembly landscape, because the burials are in, almost without exception around the boundaries of that landscape. Interesting too is the fact that there's a concentration of churches within this landscape, in and around the same boundaries that we're talking about for the burials. We see a very similar pattern in terms of the landscape around Éanach Chaltu or Éanach Teltown, which is the principal assembly place of the Nail in the northern half of the island of Ireland, where again we can probably hypothesize an estate based on a whole variety of different factors I won't go into, but where we have evidence for early medieval burial in this landscape, again it concentrates in and around the boundaries of that notional estate. And then we also get evidence for churches, most famously of course Downpatrick or Donapatrick, immediately beside Ratarthur, where Ratarthur is a royal site in its own right, but it's also the principal focus of the assembly landscape of Éanach Chaltu. We also have churches at Martry, Teltown, and further afield at Kilmainham that are probably early medieval church sites too. And this is a pattern that I suppose is replicated. I go through many, many different case studies to show you this. So you'll just have to suffice to either read my book or take my word for it. That if we look across the piece, we see time and time again burial places being associated with assembly landscapes, and we also see churches being associated with assembly landscapes. But even more particularly important is that if we take the 115 or 120 assembly landscapes that I was able to identify, at least 40 of them are associated with Downach type churches. And these are important because Downach establishments are the earliest churches known from the island of Ireland. They incorporate the Latin Dominicum, which is widely agreed to have gone out of use by around about 500 AD. So these are 5th century churches. So this tells me that actually, on the one hand, we have good evidence for the character of monuments and things that would be associated with an assembly landscape in the 5th and 6th centuries, but also that this is evidence that these places were already assemblies in the 5th and 6th centuries. And that's why missionaries may have come here. That's why these places had important community churches built within them, because Downach churches were churches that were ministry or had kind of pastoral elements for their wider community. It also tells me, very importantly, I'll come back to this later, that these are churches that are associated with early Christianity, and by proxy, given that these are royal estates and royal landscapes, that these churches are evidence in and of themselves for the role of Christianity in shaping the institution of kingship from around about the 5th or 6th centuries AD. So that's kind of context. I'm going to go through two case studies of Cashel and Tara. And I suppose here's where it gets a little bit historical, in the sense that these are the 2 case studies of the 2 major polities of first millennium AD Ireland. The Ogonacht, who controlled Munster in the southern half of Ireland, and the Inail, who controlled the northern half of Ireland and the kingship of Tara. And I suppose to give the kind of conclusion away, I'm going to suggest that ultimately Cashel and Tara both were developed as centres of kingship by the local polities for whom they were the major local centres of regional kingship. And then ultimately, because of the importance and power of those polities, they were developed into super regional polities that were identified with the kingship of Ireland. So particularly in terms of the Ogonacht, this is one of the dynasties associated with kind of a major dynastic group in that controls the southern half of the island of Ireland, with Conall Kirk being the kind of apical ancestor of a whole range of different lineages founded by his sons and offshoots that founded successful lineages all around Munster, from Cork to Kerry to Waterford, up through Tipperary and Limerick and Clare. And this is one of those kind of famous figures who lived in around about the 4th or 5th centuries, who had a load of children, all of whom managed to found successful dynasties, and then ultimately who all started to fall out and fight with each other in and around the 7th and 8th centuries AD. And that's actually a remarkably repeated pattern. So where it comes a bit of cropper in terms of that traditional Ogonocta story is when we start to think about the position of Cashel. Because actually, despite the fact that one of the things we can say from the recent work of people like Chris Lane or Jim Mallory or from Conor Newman for the Hill of Tara and for the royal sites of Ireland, the main prehistoric and kind of provincial centres, they're defined by their later prehistoric apogee, by a series of monuments that we find in the later prehistoric period that really highlight the way in which they developed in that later prehistoric into medieval period. But when we look at Cashel, we don't find this. We don't find in the landscape surrounding Cashel a prehistoric landscape. We don't find evidence of prehistoric cult. We don't find evidence of concentrated funerary activity. And this isn't for a lack of trying. I did about 70 square hectares of geophysical survey, looked at about 12 kilometers squared of LiDAR data, didn't find a single prehistoric monument. Really, tried looking for prehistoric monuments because that's what I expected to find and just didn't find it. What I found instead was that while there is some Bronze Age and Iron Age activity that is important, it's of a very different character to what we get at somewhere like Tara in the M3 road scheme. And by and large, we have a complete hiatus of activity between around about the 1st and the 5th centuries AD. And from the 5th century AD, things start to take off and we get some activity on the Rock of Cashel with late Roman amphora and with settlement activity in the surrounding landscape from the road scheme around Cashel itself too. And outside of that, outside of some pits that have Iron Age dates associated with them that don't really describe structures or anything particularly significant, we have one object from Cashel that is actually a Roman object, the fibula that you see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And while this is a very interesting object, it was found in rubble in the 19th century from the cleaning out of the roof space in Cormac's Chapel, a 12th century building, so very problematic in terms of its association with the Rock of Cashel too. Now, when it comes to the story about Cashel in the Ogonocta origin myth, Cashel is a site that's supposedly miraculously founded by the apical ancestor of the Ogonocta, Conall Kirk. And there seems to be an element of truth to that in the sense that it recognises that Cashel is a late bloomer in terms of being a royal site. But it also implies too that the dynasty that he founded, despite the historicity of this being very objectionable and debatable, probably came to Cashel from elsewhere. And for me, that's actually a site in County Limerick called Knockany. Knockany sits at the heart of a concentration of funerary monuments that is unparalleled on the island of Ireland. Within a 20-kilometre radius of the hill of Knockany, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there is 40% of all of the funerary monuments from later prehistory on the island of Ireland. This is a staggering concentration. This is an incredible landscape with a huge concentration of late prehistoric ritual, funerary, and cult monuments. So just to give you a sense of this, this is Knockany here in the center of the screen. Hopefully you can make out. I forgot to bring a laser pointer or something. But you can see that generally these barrows and funerary monuments tend to occur in clusters that define actually quite famous cemeteries in terms of places like Atnisi and Mitchelstown's down east. And generally those barrow cemeteries are within the kind of floodplains of the rivers Camogue, Maig, etc. But this is good evidence to me that this is a major later prehistoric cult landscape. And actually it has a whole range of Roman material from it in the later Roman period too, in terms of things like the Beline Hoard. And in the Ogonoct's origin myths, this is actually where the ancestors of the Ogonocta are based before Conall Kirk emerges and founds Cashel. So that's not to say, per se, that Munster is a prehistoric regional entity and that Cashel replaces Munster in terms of being a prehistoric capital for Munster, but it highlights that there's an ability from the kingship of one polity to shift from one landscape to another. And it's interesting that it shifts probably from some sort of later prehistoric cult landscape like Knockany. Even more interesting is the fact that Knockany also has all of the same monuments that you get at the Hill of Tara or at Navan Fort. I won't go into the detail here, but suffice to say there's a large internally ditched enclosure like Raunery at Tara, and there's a figure of 8-shaped building that we've identified in geophysical survey from the crest of the hilltop that's around about the same proportion as the ones from Navan Fort or from Dunalnia. And all of this points to an iconography of a later prehistoric cult landscape that, to all intents and purposes, we wouldn't really have a problem identifying as a late prehistoric royal site if we found it elsewhere. But in the Munster tradition, importantly, this is actually referred to as a place of kingship. It's referred to as a place that's associated with those ancestor figures. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily an unproblematic equation to kind of replace Cashel as a prehistoric capital of Munster with Knockany. But actually it gives the lie to, I suppose, some of the early history associated with Munster, because once we start to look at the early analytic and historical tradition in Munster, it's quite telling that the vast majority of battles that we can identify in 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th centuries Munster, despite the fact that 5th and 6th century ones are definitely not historical per se. They're actually around Knockany. They're in East County Limerick, Southwest Tipperary, North Cork. They seem to be in this border region in that area that's been fought over by the lineages that are supposedly related to each other of the Oganachta. So all of this suggests to me, and what I've argued, is that actually the Oganachta are not a single lineage. They're not one lineage descended from Alilullum or Oganmar, or indeed from Conall but that Conall is a cipher that unites two polities that warred with each other for the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, and then ultimately one polity won out and suppressed the other polity, bringing them into a new entity we now know as the Oganachta. The origin of these groups is essentially in two groups, I would argue. One is known as the Ivach and this is the group that founds Cashel and that ultimately come from Knockany. And their sort of erstwhile cousins are a group who actually in Munster tradition are the polity that controls Munster before the rise of the Oganachta. They're known as the Kirkaligda. So this is important for understanding Cashel because it highlights the fact that the polity associated with Cashel, who invested significance in Cashel, actually did it from a background of conflict. They did it from a world within which they were competing for control of the southern half of the island of Ireland with another group who actually probably controlled everything from Cork the whole way through to modern day County Kilkenny. And we see that ultimately when we map out the battles and the analytic entries for where the battles are occurring, even if they don't necessarily say where they are, they're in the territories that look like a slow progress of battle and war over a century between these groups. So when we look at the Rock of Cashel itself, it's not that we see archaeological evidence that supports this, but we see a very different landscape. It doesn't take a genius to look at the Rock of Cashel and realize it's a little bit different to the Hill of Tara or Navan Fort. It's a rock outcrop, very different from the hills that we're talking about at Tara or Navan Fort. And actually, once we drill down into the archaeology, it looks like a fortress. It looks like a place that was designed and kind of founded as a fortification. And of course, that's what the name Cashel itself comes from. Particularly when we look at the landscape evidence, a whole series of enclosures that I'd probably date to the 5th or early 7th century, if not later 6th century, series of large multi-valet forts on high ground and hilltops around Cashel. These are concentrated on the south and east and southeast facing slopes around Cashel, but not to the north, not to the northwest, and not to the west. And this again implies to me that there's an attempt in the 5th to 7th centuries to defend the Rock of Cashel as a kind of strategic location within the plains of central Munster from a polity to the south and southwest, and indeed south and southeast, and indeed the east, where we're being told in historic sources the Kirkaligda were all powerful in the 6th and 7th centuries. So these enclosures on hilltops, for me, are the kind of first phase of major activity in the Cashel landscape, essentially defending it and demarcating as a kind of an outpost within the polity of Ivach Lera. And then the name Cashel becomes a little bit more intelligible because we can understand why it was a fortification. And when we look at the archaeology of the Rock of Cashel, again, I won't go into too much detail with this, it's littered with huge orthostatic blocks that create kind of artificial platforms and enhance the natural properties of the terracing of the Rock of Cashel itself, where we have these placed on the crest of slopes and kind of break of slopes on the Rock of Cashel. And for me, these describe a whole series of fortifications and enclosures that essentially are the origin of the name Cashel as a fortified place, as a castellum. So these relict ramparts we can see in the aerial photograph, for instance, on the northeast corner of the Rock of Cashel just here. These are 6-7 meters wide, actually quite substantial earthworks. And then there's a huge gorge hewn into the northeast corner of the Rock of Cashel that's actually stepped and leads up to the summit of the Rock of Cashel, which, if I can use my mouse, it's just here. This is actually a stepped avenue leading up to the crest where we can probably envisage some sort of entrance here. These are those earthworks. And these earthworks actually can probably continue the whole way around the rock, where when we look at topographical data, LiDAR, photogrammetry, etc., we can see this kind of terracing effect of these very large ramparts on the south side of the Rock of Cashel. So again, not to go into too much detail, did some geophysics that sort of verifies this ultimately, where in the geophysics, it's clear there's a whole series of large enclosures around the Rock of Cashel, and indeed sort of nuclear style enclosures that seem to describe an arrangement of space that's in some way hierarchical, providing access to the summit, but terracing off areas of the rock itself. So for instance, there's a sort of an avenue here to the southeast of the site, and then we have this large feature here that probably corresponds with those earthworks here on the northeastern corner, and then we have evidence of a large earthwork here. So One problem with the Rock of Cashel is that it's currently owned by Ireland's richest man in the Cashel Palace Hotel. And since 2016, they've prohibited any form of research or activity at the site. We did get to do some very limited remit excavations in 2019. With my colleagues in Kilkenny Archaeology. And this essentially showed that what we were identifying in the geophysics is archaeological, the remnants of large fortifications, large rock-cut ditches, and banks upslope with the kind of level slope that you can see here in this photo actually being the result of a leveling event that happened in around about the 17th or 18th century. So the slope was actually much more precipitous originally. Likewise, Con Manning, in the 1970s, I'm going to say, excavated around the Vicar's Corral and found the footings of a wall or structure that you can see beside the ranging rod here. And while he didn't date this, it's earlier than the Vicar's Corral, and the gate piers associated with the entrance into that area. And so it can't really be later than around about 1300. So it's quite possible this is early medieval. The one on the top left-hand side of the screen, that's a large 7-meter wide ditch that my colleague Colleen excavated. And he got down to the middle fill of the ditch, which was already 1.6 meters deep. And we got an 11th century radiocarbon date from the middle fill of the ditch. Because of the limited remit, we couldn't bottom the ditch. And so we can't say exactly what date the construction of the ditch is. But we got 11th to 12th century dates from a recut from that previous excavation that we did in 2019 here, and from the middle fill of the ditch here, which shows that at the very least, these are monuments that existed at the end of the early medieval period, and some of them might actually have been recut at that point in any case. So suffice to say that for me, that's evidence that while we can't say a huge amount about the chronology or phasing of the features we can identify archaeologically, there is really a smoking gun for large fortifications around the Rock of Cashel. When it comes to activity on the Rock of Cashel, we can say very little, apart from the fact that we have late Roman amphora from the 5th or 6th centuries. And we also have a cairn that we identified in resistivity survey around the cathedral in 2013. And this, for me, is possibly the burial monument that's implied from this passage in Connellkirk and the Kirk of Ligda, where probably one of the key ancestor figures of the local lineage, the Kelningason MacNad Freik, is talked about being buried facing southward in the passage here on the screen. And it's a kind of a strange passage. It talks about him being buried beneath the seat of the kings of Cashel, which really kind of is understandable where we have a cairn that has a north-south oriented cyst at the center of it. So all of that is kind of reconstructed here in the left-hand side, left-hand side of the screen, with a photogrammetry model on the right showing again some of the evidence for these kind of topographical features. And while these aren't phased or dated very well, and we'd like to have a lot more data about the exact character of them, ultimately it does suggest that this is a different form of royal site. It's a more fortified site, at least ostensibly in its name, but also in terms of the archaeology of it. Nevertheless, once we start to look at the wider landscape, despite the fact that I would say most of those features are probably 5th, 6th, 7th century AD in terms of their origin, we do start to see changes in the Cashel landscape from around about the 6th or 7th centuries. Particularly, we see an inauguration ceremony develop where we have an emphasis on Chelach, which is a legal compact for taking possession of land and for taking over an estate in early medieval Ireland. And probably the inauguration avenue of the Kings of Cashel is this monument called Dubh, which is traceable for about 2 kilometres through the landscape surrounding Cashel. So you can see it approaching the northeast corner of the Rock of Cashel on the bottom left. What's really interesting is that at various stages along the Dubh, there's actually barrows or funerary monuments that are incorporated into the course of that monument. Particularly, for instance, here, a beautiful little barrow where the avenue kinks, otherwise, very idiosyncratically to the north, but ostensibly to draw your attention to this monument and incorporate it into that avenue. But there's also this platform mound, which you can see here in Dean's Grove, which is actually probably a bivalve barrow, which is positioned precisely at the point at which you can see the bedrock of the Rock of Cashel as you approach it from the northeast. So for me, these are really monuments being constructed to incorporate older monuments, but also to incorporate the legal rituals for taking possession of land as the Kingship of Cashel morphs from a sort of a more military ideal, an idea of kingship, to one that's really associated with a more provincial level control of territory rather than just kind of paramountcy in a military sense. Likewise, here in the street pattern around Cashel, in this beautiful aerial photograph, you can see a curvilinear pattern that for me is actually the outer enclosure of the Rock of Cashel itself. And the Dubh comes along here, and then in this area here, there's a 5th or 6th century mound with a penannular brooch inserted into it on the shore of a former lake that's now destroyed. And the place name Loch na Finna seems to be the lake of the vagina or the lake of the scabbard, which is kind of sexual symbolism associated with Irish kingship too. And then finally, just to point out one key fact is that despite the fact that I would say most royal landscapes in Ireland probably have some churches or ecclesiastical sites associated with them, the one site that doesn't is actually the Rock of Cashel, where we don't have a single site apart from a church on the Rock of Cashel itself that we can say was probably founded in the conversion period. And this is very idiosyncratic for any landscape in 5th to 7th century Ireland, and probably for me is best explained by the fact that this is a landscape that was being contested, that was being fought over actively in the 5th and 6th centuries in order to explain the absence of churches, which is, is quite strange otherwise. Likewise, then, when we look at the place name evidence from the Rock of Cashel, from the royal estate, we can see lots of place name evidence around the royal estate that actually incorporates the names of smaller polities and groups who held offices within the royal household of the King of Cashel, but seem to be associated with particular ring forts that are multi-valet ring forts with clusters of univalet ring forts associated with them. And for me, this is actually about creating a hierarchy within the settlement pattern of this royal estate that reflects the offices that these subject polities had within the royal household. And again, goes back to now power in this kind of 600 to 800 period being manufactured in a very different way, manufactured through febas or royal standing, and that ultimately being connected to the role of people within royal households rather than anything else. That's paralleled too in place name evidence that talks about dignity, honor, and preeminence, the place of the king, the place of the prince, etc., in the royal landscape, again within the royal estate. And some of these are connected to polities that we know from the genealogies of these polities. These were actually the principal royal sites of these and surrounding peoples. And then the kind of final stage at Cashel is the construction of a church on the crest of the hilltop. I won't go into the detail of this, but suffice to say, this is very unusual within an Irish royal site to have at the core of the kind of central precinct an ecclesiastical building. And this is probably constructed in around about 820, 825 by Philip Leverhulme Prize. And actually, very importantly for my purposes, when it was constructed, it's almost kind of present in the Vita Tripartita of perhaps 830 or so by St. Patrick's visit to Cashel, when he essentially talks about idols falling on their faces. This is, the triumph of Christianity. But even more so, Philip Leverhulme was probably, Philip Leverhulme was probably a close friend of Angus, who composed the Martyrology of Angus, where very famously the other royal sites, Owenmaka, Tara, etc., are contrasted with as being grass-grown with the kind of flourishing ecclesiastical centres of Christendom. This is probably a reference to the fact that a cleric has just ascended to Cashel, and that's Cashel's absence is almost kind of felt by it not being there. And then the final stage of inauguration is associated with the pronouncement of a blessing and a sort of genealogy for the king at a place called Rona, Ireland, which is Ballinree Fort, place of the king, to the southwest of Cashel. And here again, at the final stage of inauguration, some 2 kilometres to the southwest, we have reference to royal power being stronger than the Druid, surpassing a testament, surpassing fire and death, and then imploring the king to travel throughout his estates and collect his dues, almost kind of implying that he takes possessions of the kind of entities associated with governance. So then, very briefly, to move on to the Inail in the north, and to think about a sort of a rejoinder to that Cashel case study. The Inail famously founded a series of lineages descended from Niall Noigallach, but I think the evidence of people like Alva McShaughran's scholarship and Brian Lacey's really implores us to question that in recent decades. And for my purposes, I would agree with them in the sense that I don't think the Inail are a single dynasty founded by a single individual. There might be 1 or 2 lineages that are actually descended from somebody called Niall, perhaps, but the vast majority of the other dynasties seem to have been adopted into the Inail superstructure through the creation of a sort of a genealogical fiction, much as we're talking about at the Oganacht and Cashel in Munster. And I think important for understanding the context of the Hill of Tara is to reflect on the 2 most important of those dynasties in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Cloncoman and the Síl na Sloine. Because in the analytic evidence that we do have from the 6th to the 8th centuries, these are perhaps founded as one lineage or they're related in some shape or fashion, but they're each associated then with Uisneach and the Hill of Tara by around about the start of the 8th centuries AD. And it's very probable that if the Síl na Sloine hadn't won out in that battle within the 7th century, that we would perhaps talk about Uisneach, the site on the left in County Westmeath, as actually being the seat of a kingship of Ireland today. Now, that's a bit of a tall claim, but I'm willing to justify it. So really, I suppose this is, from my perspective, this is what the group of the Inail are. This is a whole series of lineages, some of which are affiliated by actual biological affinity, but they're in a minority. And the rest are groups that are adopted into the Inail Federation because in the 5th and 6th centuries, some of the lineages of the Inail became particularly powerful, that adopting their identity and adopting that lineage and affiliation actually was a way to serve the exercise of power and construction of authority. And then emerging from that is the dynasties of Cloncolman and Síl-Nád-Uisleáine, who become so important. So when we look at the Kingdom of Brega, which is controlled by the Síl-Nád-Uisleáine, actually we have very little evidence for a Kingdom of Brega before the 8th centuries AD. We certainly have evidence that the Síl-Nád-Uisleáine controlled the region that became Brega, but they don't actually use the title King of Brega until the 8th century AD, which is very interesting in and of itself. Nevertheless, one of the key points is that their power and their control of Tara and the kingship of Brega, as much as a territory of Brega, is actually predicated on their ability to compel all of the different subject polities that we see replicated on the screen and from the first couple of slides, that kind of patchwork of different kingdoms, to essentially be subject to them. And all of these groups and regions or territories, whatever we want to call them, these retained some element of autonomous status. They also had their own royal sites, and what we see actually in the period is the subjection of some of those royal sites in different ways to the exercise of power and the construction of kingship for those different dynasties and lineages that emerged within Síl-Nád-Uisleáine and indeed within the dynasties of Cloncolman who were left in County Meath and Dublin. So when we look at the kind of principal royal sites that we know about from Brega, from the Kingdom of Brega, principally we're talking about two sites, Knowth and Lagore, which I'll mention very, very briefly. And for me, the key point about their long-term development, won't go into the detail of it, is actually they seem to be sites with a long kind of history of ritual and cult activity. But from around about the 7th century AD, something changes and they become much more akin to the sort of residential sites we would think about in terms of a royal palatial site, and they change very fundamentally. So I'll just illustrate this with Lagore. We published this in the Journal of Archaeological Science recently, where we did a paleoecological study of the ecological setting of the Crannog of Lagore to try and reconstruct phases of activity. And ultimately what we were able to show is that this is definitely a prehistoric site, even though the excavator Henkin suggested it wasn't. And it seems to be a site that begins in the kind of earlier to middle Iron Age and then has a series of phases or pulses of activity associated with the use of the Crannog platform. Particularly for my purposes, there's a whole series of human remains associated with this platform before it becomes a Crannog, and there's periods of human sacrifice ultimately implied by that collection of human remains, including deposition in the Bronze Age, deposition in the Iron Age, and in the early medieval period. And in terms of the character of how those remains are deposited in the Iron Age and the early medieval period, they're extraordinarily violent. So in terms of the Iron Age remains, these are women and children's long bones, not the torsos or hands or feet of these individuals. They're showing green fractures. They've been removed before they were deposited in the lake. And then in the early medieval period, these are almost exclusively the backs of the skulls of robust male individuals deposited on the northeast side of the Crannog. About 17 different individuals represented. Now, in this case, the back of the skull of these individuals has been hacked and cut off very precisely with an axe and then with a knife. And then this one piece of these individuals has been brought to exactly the same spot over a 300-400 year period and deposited in the lake shallows. And then afterwards, this stops. There's no more human remains, no more human sacrifice, and it becomes a royal residence and a local seat of kingship for the dynasty of the Cernig, a branch of Síl-Nád-Uisleáine. And then, likewise, if there is a seat of kingship for a kingdom of Brega, it's probably Brúna Bóinne. It's probably the landscape formed by Newgrange and Knowth, where we have, as is well documented, evidence for a cult shrine or cult focus in terms of the material from the entrance into Newgrange. And I suppose when we think about Newgrange, we think about this atrocity of a reconstruction that we can see in the centre of the screen today. But actually, if we think about what it looked like around about 1900 before its excavation, it probably looks much more akin to something on the top left in the early medieval period, something a little bit numinous, surrounded by trees, and a little bit otherworldly. More particularly, we know from historical sources that Knowth was the seat of one of the main lineages of Síl-Nád-Uisleáine. And what we see in Knowth is actually probably the creation of a royal monument for inauguration and assembly. We see from around about the point at which the Síl-Nád-Uisleáine emerges as an individual dynasty, the creation of a series of tombs for the forebears or ancestors of this dynasty, by the opening up of the satellite passage tombs at Knowth and the insertion of burials into them. Then from around about 700 to 750, we see the creation of a stepped mound. I would see it as a stepped mound rather than a ring fort, contra George Ogan, at the passage tomb of Knowth itself. both because of the profile of the ditches dug into it, and also because in the 8th century, the passage tomb chambers are actually entered. And in the orthostats of the passage tomb chambers, there's a whole series of inscriptions of 8th and very early 9th century AD in date, in scholastic ogham and in Sidra script. But the names in these inscriptions are essentially gibberish. They don't make sense. They're not names that we find in the corpus of 40,000 personal names. So for me, these are an attempt to kind of access the otherworldly knowledge as a part of inauguration rituals that a king would be expected to access by the act of entering the otherworld and sort of having a union with the sovereignty goddess. So for me, Naut is the seat of a kingship of Brega, at least in the 8th century AD. And that leaves the issue of Tara, and it's actually quite a thorny one. But when we look at Tara and we look at what we know from other major royal landscapes, we actually see a landscape that isn't too dissimilar to what we have at maybe somewhere like Dunalnya or Éanach Carmen, where we see a whole host of monuments constructed in the early medieval period in the landscape surrounding Tara. And while it's been suggested that there's a whole series of monuments that essentially defend Tara to the north and west from a threat emanating in the north, actually there's also a series of comparable monuments on the south and east on the sort of ridges and hilltops, much similar to what we see at Cashel. Nevertheless, once we get into the early medieval period, what is striking about the Tara landscape is the degree to which there's a whole host of cemetery settlements that I would suggest are associated with assembly, and indeed churches that are associated with the early medieval period and kind of missionary saints that isn't out of place in any other royal landscape from the period. When we look at the Hill of Tara itself, there's actually strong evidence now for early medieval activity on the Hill of Tara, principally through the work of people like Owen Grogan, Conor Newman, and others. We can point to a whole series of burials that have been dated to the early medieval period, 7th to 9th and 10th and 11th century and later date. From the Rath of the Synods, we can point perhaps to an avenue identified as early medieval by Conor Newman in terms of Choc Curta used for inaugurations. And we can certainly point to something like Choc Cormac as an early medieval ring fort constructed at the heart of the Hill of Tara. And for me, in terms of how the inauguration ceremony was enacted, again, like at Cashel, we see evidence of Challoch, or this legal compact for the taking possession of land, being incorporated into inauguration terminology and the texts that talk about inauguration in this period. So this is talking about a different form of kingship, not one based on cult and ritual, as perhaps it was in the 5th and 6th centuries, but one based on the control of land and ultimately a different form of rulership, a form of rulership based on territoriality and on a sovereignty that has a conception of territoriality at its core. Most interestingly is the fact that the burials are actually from the Rath of the Synods, immediately adjacent to St. Patrick's Church on the Hill of Tara. And actually we have reference to a church in the annals at Tara itself, Choc Corpin Ucht Taver, the church or building of Corpin, a British missionary saint at Tara. So again, like, for instance, Armagh relative to Navan Fort, or indeed Killashee or Kilcullen relative to Dunalnya, this is probably evidence that there is an early medieval church as a part of the early medieval complex at Tara. So where that leaves us is probably in a world where kingship has changed very fundamentally in those two case studies of Tara and Cashel, but we see a relative pattern where we see landscapes that are actively used in the early medieval period, but are reimagined as a ceremonial landscape develops perhaps in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, and that sees maybe a more residential element. It sees certainly an inauguration apparatus develop too. But they're not the only landscapes. And this is probably the key point, because we have many other candidates for places in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries that could have been seats of major regional kingship. We only need to look, for instance, at Brussels Town's ring. I see Dirk, although he's more interested in the Bronze Age aspect of this landscape. In the 6th century, this is one of the most important royal sites on the island of Ireland. So much so that a king from Donegal, who's the leader of the Nail, came down to this part of County Wicklow to essentially get sent back in a coffin. This is a very, very important royal site of the southeastern corner of the island of Ireland. And myself and James O'Driscoll have suggested it's probably a centre of a regional polity at that point in time too. And if we look at, for instance, the tuha structure of places like the Kingdom of Ifeilán from the 11th to 12th centuries on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see from the reconstruction of that tuha from Paul McCotter's work, or indeed from the distribution of assembly places within that kingdom, that there's clearly evidence for antiquated polities within those territories. And I would suggest that actually the reason why Dunalnya and Éanach Carmen become the assembly places and capital of the province of Leinster is actually to do with the power of Ifeilán and the power of their cousins, the Muradig and the Dunlaninga, ultimately in the 7th and 8th centuries in controlling Leinster. And these actually sit at the heart of their kingdom. So I think that reflects on the fact that These places we talk about as provincial royal sites. These are provincial royal sites and the centres of the provinces from the 8th century in the annals to a certain degree, but they are so because of the role they have in the contemporary politics of the polities associated with them. And that's probably not too dissimilar an explanation to explain why, for instance, Rathcroghan becomes so important in Connacht, or indeed why Navan Fort becomes so important in Ulster, or as I've just suggested, why Dunallen becomes so important in terms of Leinster. And if we think about at least those 3 sites, bearing in mind that Cashel and Tara are the only 2 sites that have evidence for inauguration in the early medieval period, actually what unites those 3 provincial centres is the fact that they are centres of super-local assemblies in the early medieval period. These are places that actually in the annals, from the 8th and 9th centuries, these are associated with the making of laws over peoples and territories, and actually associated with the major polities of that period. They might not necessarily have been previously. And if we zoom out and think about how we might look at that process and think about what that means in terms of wider social structures, I think actually the burial evidence on a very large scale is actually quite interesting. So I mentioned we probably have evidence from the way in which assembly landscapes develop in terms of burials and churches being concentrated in them in the 5th and 6th centuries, that for me this is good evidence of the role of Christianity in shaping kingship, but also social structure at that point in time. If we think about that and think about the way in which burial develops then in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, actually we have good evidence that lots of the places that were founded in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries as places of local assembly and burial actually continue to be used into the 8th, 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. But while they die out quite slowly. So we have some still being used in the 10th and 11th centuries. So it's difficult to explain this as being a kind of slow burn Christianization as burial is removed to the church. But if we flip that on its head and we look at that data differently and ask, when did cemeteries stop being founded outside of church sites in Ireland? By and large, there's only a small handful we can point to as being founded after the 7th century AD, as replicated on the screen. So for me, what this suggests is actually the erosion of the autonomy of local polities, their ability to found the place associated with their local governance. And this manifests the way in which regional polities, the regional entities we might think of as provinces, are essentially gaining power over these local peoples too. And if we look very briefly at settlement evidence from the period, and we know that early medieval Ireland has the richest settlement archaeology of any region in northwestern Europe, but one of the things that defines it is the fact that it has an inbuilt hierarchy in terms of univalet, bivalet, trivalet, or quadrivalet. But there's actually a reasonable body of evidence to suggest that there might be a kind of an inbuilt chronology to those sites too, with the degree of valation actually being related to how early or late they are. So the multivalet sites, by and large, tend to be very slightly earlier. So I would suggest that actually what we have is a series of high status sites being built in the end of the 5th century into the start of the 7th century. And then we have the boom of the kind of normal ring fort in the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries that actually manifests not just an inbuilt hierarchy that existed in early medieval Ireland in this period, but actually creates that hierarchy. It actually creates the way in which society is structured and stratified. This is important because actually on the continent, this is exactly what we see in settlements too, where enclosure becomes a feature of settlement in the 7th and 8th centuries. And the settlements are very different, in case of the example, from Britain or France or Germany or whatever it might be. But ultimately, the way in which scholarship has explained this is to say that actually this change in the enclosure and kind of planning of settlements from the 7th and 8th centuries is a manifestation of hierarchy and essentially a transition to a mode of landscape organization that's based on territoriality and ownership of land rather than essentially kinship-based structures. And then very briefly, to highlight the context of that in a more historical sense, we're actually talking about the period in the 7th and 8th centuries when all of our law tracts come from on the island of Ireland, and actually where we have the evidence of 2 different law traditions. So we have on the one hand, the legal tradition of the Seanachas Mór that reflects the northern half of the island of Ireland, and then we have the legal tradition of the Brehon Nevid, which reflects the southern half of the island of Ireland. I would say it reflects the traditions of the Inéil and the Óganachta. And I don't think it's any surprise that those texts are all that make up those 2 legal traditions are all composed in the period 650 to 750. There's, for instance, 5 different status tracts in that corpus of textual traditions concerning law, and those 5 different status tracts agree on very, very little. So for me, these texts are set down in that period, 650 to 750, not because people acquired literacy for the first time at that point in time, but actually because they're a part of the broader changes we see in burial and settlement too at that point in time. This is about a society creating a hierarchy for the first time, creating a new hierarchy and codifying both in textual form, but also in the monumentality of settlement enclosures too. We see this even in the fact of poems and other aspects of legal frameworks at the time that encourages kings to be law-giving kings, that encourages kings to exercise, for instance, capital punishment. We've very little evidence for capital punishment in terms of the archaeological record and osteological evidence, but there is one possible execution cemetery somewhere at Kiltale in County Meath that actually is from an assembly landscape too, which is quite interesting in this context. That period 650 to 800 is also the period when we get the so-called provincial centres, being the places where legal frameworks, coins or coiny, are actually used to create what we could talk about as law provinces, to create frameworks within which people are bound to a certain sense of territoriality and kinship by their subscription to those legal frameworks. And then very briefly, finally, to point out that we also see in that period key changes to the sites that had been royal sites in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries. From the 8th and 9th centuries, we see a huge host of these fall out of use. We see many of them decline in terms of their use, and we actually see some of them actually become elaborated. But the ones that become elaborated are actually probably being elaborated because they're now no longer places of local kingship, local power. They're actually being co-opted to processes of polity building connected with those regional jurisdictions and territorial frameworks. For instance, this local assembly place at Éanna Clogher in County Limerick is probably becoming the assembly place of the province of Munster. And my hometown, Nina, on the top right, this is a Neolithic complex on a natural knoll at Tullahedy that's enclosed within a ditch in the early medieval period to create a mound that becomes a centre of feasting as the local cemeteries all fall out of use around about 700. And then likewise, when we look at the royal sites that have been excavated from the period, for instance, Naut and Lagore, which we've already touched on, again, it's in the 9th and 10th centuries that we see key changes at these sites, where we see them not shift to being residential sites. They're residential perhaps from the 8th century, but we see them actually having clusters of settlements. Now, Lagore, you could argue the point about what that might mean, but I would suggest that even though Henkin didn't find any structures that he identified as settlements, the excavators are standing in some on the right-hand side of the screen. They just didn't realize what they were. And actually at Naut, we have a complex that in the 9th and 10th centuries is much more like a villa regalis. It's much more like a place for storing the product of the land and all of the things that are paid to kings as a part of taxation. We have a whole series of souterrains, dozens of souterrains constructed in the passage tombs and in the satellite passage tombs that reflect the storage of wealth for me. And then to finish, to point out the big problem is that outside of those couple of royal sites that have been excavated, where we can talk about how they changed in the 9th and 10th centuries, we actually have a huge problem, because we can say for certain there's key changes happening both in society, but also in terms of the archaeology of royal sites in the 9th and 10th centuries. But exactly how we speak about those archaeologically is actually still a massive, massive problem, because we don't necessarily fully understand what settlement looks like in the period, and we don't necessarily target places that are powerful and important in the 9th to 12th centuries for excavation or landscape-based projects. So whether that's Lough Ennel or Kincora in Killaloe. But what we can say is that there's certainly a more stronger influence of the church. And we do see some ecclesiastical sites get co-opted as major royal sites in places like Kells, for instance, or Armagh. And we do see patronage in terms of high crosses and pre-Romanesque churches that manifest one of the strategies, at least in terms of their archaeological visibility. But perhaps one of the things that happens here is not so much that local royal sites fall out of use, but actually, from my perspective, I would argue that what happens is that the relevance of local royal sites to the creation of power at a local scale has been changed fundamentally by the rise of major regional polities in the 9th century, or in the 8th and 9th century. And as a correlate, the way in which those local kings found power was actually within royal households, within the retinues of the major regional kings, rather than within the performance of their local rights of kingship or local rights of social cohesion within places like Moyna, Lough, Clogher, etc. from earlier centuries. So that's where I leave it, on hopefully a bit of a cliffhanger. The 9th to 12th century has been a massive problem. This is actually how it finishes in the book, with about 2 paragraphs from around about 850 onwards. So it's a little bit of a disappointing ending, but hopefully that doesn't dissuade anybody from buying it, so I can get my 10 pence of royalties from every copy sold. So that's it for me, guys. Thanks very much for having me, and hopefully there's been something in that for everybody.
So much indeed. That was unbelievable. I mean, it really, it just makes me absolutely convinced I need to buy your book, and you'll certainly get your 10 pence royalties from me, because that was a sensational lecture. So much information. I'm sure your heads are all absolutely buzzing, and I'm sure some of you would like to ask Paddy a question if you're willing to. Answer.
sounds very similar to the kinship relations of the clans in Scotland. Would you comparatively say that that's how it's worked?
I'm not quite sure. I don't know a huge amount about it's kind of late medieval clan system in Scotland.
Yes, well, the evolution of like the clans and the sort of like condensing of the clans into wider and wider groups to eventually you end up with the King of Scotland.
Yeah, I suppose I tend to shy away from a more kind of evolutionary approach to it, in the sense of I don't think it was kind of predetermined that it would go in this direction, but I think what we do see in terms of the language of kinship being used to express political affiliation, certainly maybe that's the analogy, you know, that's the key point. And while perhaps the language of kinship has been used to express political alignment and affiliation, we haven't necessarily appreciated the fact that that language of kinship is made up, you know, that in a sense, when we've talked about dynasties and these large regional unions like the Nail and the Oganach, that they share a kinship in terms of the structure that knits them together, but actually their origins is very different as a whole host of politics. But as one gets subjected to the other, the natural thing to do is to create a new hierarchy, and that new hierarchy is framed in terms of the language of kinship because it's connected to land and all these things in Irish culture. But in terms of what those dynasties are, probably the closest analogy I would have to it is something like the Anglo-Saxon royal houses in terms of the period in question, where you have a whole host of different lineages and groups that could theoretically claim to be important or regionally significant, but amongst them, one lineage emerges in the 7th into the 8th century, the dominant one, that becomes the royal house. That does seem to be what we see in Ireland, in the sense of, you know, seeing it like woman controlling the Nail and everything to go with it in the 7th and 8th centuries. The difference is perhaps that one of the things that never seems to have happened to the same degree in early medieval Ireland is the narrowing of the bands of kinship or eligibility for kingship, where there was definitely an attempt to do that. There was definitely an attempt to make kingship something that's concentrated within particular lineages within those dynastic confederacies. Actually, all of the textual sources that we have that talk about, for instance, the Connachurk and the Kirkaleigta, or the Oganach or the Nail, that's actually what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, well, this one lineage is destined to rule us all because their ancestor was blessed by St. Patrick or whatever it might be. But actually, in reality, that never seems to have actually happened. That's how we're able to unpick all of these things, by looking at the historic sources. So that's probably one of the key differences, that while some lineages tended over time to be much more important and successful, ultimately the retention of that aspect of kinship to the way in which power was framed allowed other lineages to essentially attach themselves or to rise from nothing and control the dynasties too. So I don't actually know what happened too much in terms of the late medieval analogies in Scotland, but certainly I suppose maybe that language of kinship framing structures of power maybe would be the one behind that. If that answers your question, but maybe a good analogy.
Thank you so much. Incredible, interesting. Just one aspect, you referred to the burial places, the places of assembly, and then ultimately that they became sites of churches. And then if I followed you right, that increasingly toward from the 8th century onwards, there was a growing tension between the right church and then of the local rulers. I'm just wondering, in that context, one of the very few liturgical texts we have is the Stowe Missal or Laura Missal from the 8th century. I think it's folio 27 verso. It actually, in the canon of the Mass, it makes allusion that the founder of this church be converted from idols. And I'm just wondering, was there a period of time where clearly those who were rulers were holding on to their sacred powers and at the same time being prepared to found churches in these places of assembly?
Yeah, there's probably a reasonable body of evidence for both scenarios there to be apt. I would lean towards the former, sort of in a sense of there has been a lot of scholarship written about how burial rites developed, principally Betty O'Brien's Magisterial Map and Death Project and her book 2020, a really excellent volume. I suppose that one of the kind of key tenets of that is that ultimately, when burial develops from the 5th century onwards, we get East West. This isn't necessarily Christian to believe that is the case, and that's a valid argument. but that really we only start to get the true kind of Christianization. Doesn't mean burials can't be Christian previously, but kind of Christianization of burial rights by the removal of burial to the church from around the 8th century AD. I suppose I was always come back to that and think about, well, actually, if the canonical law tracts and literature of that period are talking about the need to bury, and actually, when you think about the evidence we do have from these landscapes, so you take the example of Carmen, or I could come up with many other examples, and when we start to get 5th century burial rights developing in those new cemeteries and new burial rights developing in those landscapes, they're happening at the same time as the churches are being constructed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every East-West extended animation in the 5th century is Christian, but there's definitely a Christianizing context. And I think one of the reasons that those churches are there in the first place is because of the importance of those landscapes already to the polities in question, because this is the logical place to go to minister to a community, to preach and convert that. So I shy away from the idea that could happen in a world where ostensibly the rulers weren't sympathetic to Christianity, or indeed the people being buried with this new rite of burial from around about the 5th century aren't in some way Christian too. And actually, the idea that there's a shift to churchyard burial is it's kind of it really depends what your perspective is, because, sometimes these cemeteries are actually in proximity to churches. Does that mean they're not part of the churchyard, or they're not part of the church landscape? So for me, what happens isn't so much that there's a kind of a increased Christian aspect to these landscapes through time, but actually that probably relatively quickly Christianity becomes a key feature of how these landscapes are conditioned and how the ideas of how they develop are harnessed too. Now, I can't prove that beyond doubt, nobody could, but for me, the longevity with which some sites stay in use into the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, that's important. But also the fact that those churches are by and large conversion period churches, often associated with documented missionaries. Doesn't necessarily mean figures are completely historical, but the Download churches particularly are a particular form of pastoral church in terms of what they do. And we have a paper in the Making Christian Landscapes volume in 2020, I'm going to say, or maybe 2017, edited by Tommaso Caragone and Sam Turner, where we actually suggested in the Aina Carmen case that what we're seeing there is an organised mission associated with Palladius, because a lot of the churches in and around that landscape are associated with the followers of Palladius, Secundinus and Auxilius in terms of the church on Killashee. So I think what we see in these landscapes is that these are the places where missions come, but relatively quickly Christianity is adopted, and definitely there's a debate to be had about how quickly it becomes adopted and transplants other religious frameworks, but certainly they seem to have built churches within these places of Christian worship by the 5th century AD. So that doesn't mean that there's not some element of relics paganism or whatever we might want to call it, pre-Christian belief. There's probably just a myriad of people's different worldviews becoming attached to these landscapes in any case. The other side to that is that in many cases we probably have landscapes in these areas that are in some sense pre-Christian places of importance. I just mean that I don't mean that religious alignment, but I just mean it in political importance. So you could look at somewhere like Telltown and look at the evidence that perhaps Ned Kelly has highlighted in terms of lots of wells from that landscape, and evidence of open activity in late Roman centuries. That would suggest to me that this is a cult base prior to the coming of Christianity. But you could also look at the Hill of Tara, and if that church, St. Patrick's Church, is an early medieval church, as it seems to be the one connected to Urbanus in the 6th century in the Annals, then again we have a church built by a British missionary in the very core of the Hill of Tara itself. I find it hard, for instance, to believe that St. Patrick's Church of Armagh is only a kilometre away from Navan Fort by accident. So I think there's not a smoking gun, but there's certainly enough in terms of those correlations, for me at least, to suggest that Christianity fast becomes the key ideological framework for how these sites develop. And by inference, to me, one of the key drivers in how kingship is an institution. That's one of the reasons that you start to see a very different form of kingship emerge in the 7th century.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating and a lot to think about. Food for thought, the sort of evolution of kingships and royal sites. You mentioned early on the place name element, Donach, and I would just like to sound a little caution there, because I think you may be referring to Deirdre Flanagan's work, and I think part of the problem is that she published on that in the 70s and 80s, and maybe nobody's kind of, overtly contradicted it in something where they've written particularly on that one topic. But I think if you consulted toponymists nowadays, I think there would be a lot less dogmatic about being able to, say that the element became obsolete so early. What date were you thinking of?
Well, so it's actually Charles Edwards that suggests this. So I've kind of followed him.
Yeah.
Obviously, he gets it from theatre planning.
Yeah.
But he does suggest that this is a anamastic feature that goes out to use around about 500 in terms of evidence for Dominican too.
I think that's way too early. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that, for example, you've got obvious examples where Donach is combined with words that are usually, don't really come into use until the Norman era, like Donach D. The D is a dike and seems to refer to the Norman motte there, and I don't think there's a lot of pre-Norman evidence for that name. And Donach Henry, the personal name Henry is essentially a Norman name that isn't attested as an early medieval Irish name. So that it's true that many of the Donach sites are early, but I think it's just hard to be dogmatic about it.
Of course, yeah. Hopefully, I wasn't coming across as dogmatic, but I'm just taking my leave from people who know far more things about.
I think the problem is the lack of publications.
Yeah. I think
I think thinking has progressed since then.
The way I'd come at it is not so much to hinge it just on the Donach place names that necessarily use 400 or 450 or 500 or 550 or 600. By and large, say the work of the Making Christian Landscapes project would suggest that the vast majority of churches in Ireland were founded before the end of the 7th century. Now, there's still the same sort of circular argument as what you're suggesting there, but that's a can of worms I've never really wanted to open. So you can make the same argument about kill. We usually assume in the vast majority of medieval literature that kill is a toponym that by and large suggests this is an early medieval church, usually founded before the 8th century. But actually, exactly as you're saying, there's a lot of tautology to how that idea has been constructed. So that's kind of a can of worms I don't particularly want to open. But I do think that despite going down the road of maybe each individual toponym we can debate, what it might mean and how early it might be and all the problems and caveats we necessarily need. By and large, things like the Making Christian Landscapes project would suggest that the vast majority of these churches in these lands have been founded by the 7th century at the latest, in terms of evidence for the supposed life of the saints involved. Again, that's hearsay to a certain degree too, isn't it? So I think that from that perspective, it would still still come down to the same conclusion for me, that these churches being in these landscapes, it doesn't matter whether one is necessarily 5th century and one is 7th century. We're still talking about concentrations of churches within these landscapes. By and large, most scholars would agree before the end of the 7th century. At the same time, we're also seeing the new form of monumentality for burial, a whole range of new cemeteries that emerge. Again, they all only started in the 5th century. We have no evidence for East-West extended animation before 400. We have no evidence for the vast majority of these cemeteries that are defined by East-West extended animation before 400, and the vast majority are really starting in the 5th and 6th century. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming at it from. It's not necessarily to say, well, every Donach church necessarily should be 5th century. It's just some people have suggested that. But I do think the fact that we have cemeteries as well is the two monumentalities, if you want, that define these landscapes in the 5th to 7th centuries are church sites and cemeteries, and the cemeteries being used as places of assembly. And then again, when you step back, the fact that we have a relative concentration of these Donach churches, particularly associated with assembly landscapes. Actually, the reason I'm more interested in that isn't necessarily because they're 5th century per se, that's a smoking gun to a certain degree, but it's actually because it implies the more kind of administrative functions for the churches in those landscapes. So if the assembly place is the place for the governance of a community, then it actually makes sense that the administrative church for the governance of that community pastoral sense is in that landscape. Actually, I would quite like the idea that churches could be redesignated as Dominic churches in the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries because of that. Jurisdictions and all those sorts of things. The one that would probably give me pause to think about the earliness of the Dominic churches per se is that passage in the Liber Angeli that talks about all the churches named down. I forget exactly what the date. I think it's around about 630. Is it Liber Angeli? Any helpers? It's Liber Angeli is earlier. We're going to say earlier to mid 7th century. So I think, you know, given that that would be one of the earliest texts to survive from early medieval Ireland, that's a very interesting passage in terms of that specific toponym per se. But I absolutely 100% prefer much more about toponymy and onomastics than me, and I'm very happy to be correct about that one a little bit.
I think sometimes we're just very slow to publish.
Yeah.
No, you would need to look into individual place name surveys, whereas kind of sources like Deirdre Flanagan is very handy to get a sort of a condensed treatment of one particular element, and that, you know, nobody's written anything that kind of supersedes it. You know, but in fact the thinking has kind of moved on. If you look at treatments of individual names.
Question, anybody? Can I ask about the specific parts of the skeletons that you find with males in the northeast and the female children? Why do you think that? It was a been a bad crop, and therefore that was the ritual. Get rid of the king, give him the chop, but bury part of him.
Yeah, I've spent about 15 years trying to figure this one out. I started working on this in about 2007, master's thesis, and I'm still obsessed with the site. I'm still trying to figure out what it all means, and I've tried various ways to approach it in terms of looking at human remains directly, in terms of trying to rephase the site. Spent hours and hours in the National Museum of Art, photographed files, the archive for Ligor, and ultimately I've arrived at the point where Ligor is gone. You know, our ability to reinterpret stratigraphy and rephase the site based on the archive just doesn't exist. So what we can say from the paleoecological work that we did is that the human remains aren't accidentally there. You know, there's something that definitely starts off in the Iron Age at that site, at that sort of platform. And it's not a chrono, it's kind of something that comes later, a residential aspect. So that's an important context for how we interpret those remains. But there is definitely pattern in terms of chronology, but also gender aspect. As you said, have the female and children's long bones associated with the southwest of the site, and then that stays around about 400 AD, and 400 AD we get the occipital, so a very different part of the skull, but principally all from that period, 400 to 700 from the northeast and south. For me, the northeast and southwest is a kind of cosmological aspect to it, and there's a counterpoint, and that's the reason that they're across that long period of time. It's those two particular areas of the site, but what the actual remains themselves are is, you know, your guess is as good as mine, and so I can only offer my complete hypothesis. And one is actually that in the terms of the southwest aspect of the female and children's Islam, the southwest is often associated with mythology and sovereignty goddesses, we or the Hag of Bera in early Irish tradition in terms of literature. Argue the point about whether that's reliable or not. But so perhaps this is in some way a kind of a surrogate sovereignty goddess or female sovereign figure to a certain degree, and that's been sacrificed in some way at this site. The lake itself, Ligor, comes from Loch Gower, where white horse sovereignty symbolism associated with Conor Newman and Braidney Philipin, but I forget the first word. Our first name we talked about. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. And have talked about that aspect of sovereignty associated with the symbolism of the Ligor, White Mares, the Gowra Valley. So for the southwest portion, that would kind of be my hypothesis. Then when we get into the early medieval period, that's a little bit different. And one of the things that makes it change a little bit with that is that these are all robust male individuals. It's one, you know, it's one piece of skeleton, so you can't say necessarily that they're all definitely male. age to a certain degree. But where we can, or have a reasonable evidence, there generally tend to be more likely than not to be robust male individuals. It's exceedingly violent. So I wrote a paper on it in Vietnamese with a colleague of mine who was doing her PhDs. She was an osteological specialist, and she pointed out that actually when we're talking about this specific piece of the back of the skull, it looks like how these people have been dispatched is by exactly the same right. So they've been in a kneeling position, they've had a pole axe driven into the top of the head, and then instead of just breaking off the piece of the skull, somebody's taken a knife to cut precisely the exact piece of skull that they want. But that piece of skull would have still had elements of the spinal column, brain attached. So what we're talking about is exceedingly gory. This is violence, on steroids. And given that this is on a platform in a lake shallows that isn't surrounded by a palisade at this point, this would have been highly visible. So I think this is definitely performative violence. Because of the similarity of pattern and dispatch, could this be capital punishment? Could it be evidence of judicial practice, which I think is actually very interesting in terms of thinking about kingship and the powers of kings, that poem I had from the 7th century. The other side of it is to think about the fact that this is only 10 kilometers so from the Tower. Conor Newman has actually suggested that Lagore is the starting point of inauguration ceremonies for the Hill of Tara. So I do wonder to a certain degree whether these could actually be the remains of kind of spent kings, the people who preceded somebody in the kingship. In terms, I could never prove that, but in terms of the chronology of it, because up until around about the 8th century, most kings of Tara that we have in the historical sources, I believe, died by violent means. That doesn't necessarily mean they all died at Lagore. But given that we don't have the remainder of these bodies, it's very difficult to say for certain whether they're disposed of at the site or buried in the lake shallows outside of the excavation area, or whether the piece of skull is brought back. Perhaps there's one of the starting aspects of it. There's absolutely no evidence to prove. The one thing that goes against that and perhaps suggests that it's more kind of judicial in terms of the character of it, is that there was one piece of vertebra in the assemblage, and that showed evidence of hanging by the neck, where the vertebra had been crushed in a very specific way. So in that case, people have been hung before they've been semi-decapitated. This piece of the skull has been crushed. And that doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility that these are former kings who've been disposed of, but it would suggest more likely that there's an element of judicial or execution associated with that. They're not kind of mutually exclusive in a sense. But yeah, spent over a decade trying to figure that one out. Anybody else's guessing is good. Not the most satisfying answer, but
I think maybe we'll draw it to a close.
Okay.
And I thank you very, very much indeed, Paddy, for a little token of appreciation. So thank you so much indeed. Just before you disappear, just to remind you that next month we have our AGM and our now traditional slideshow of activities from last year. So I hope you'll be able to make it then. It's the 23rd of February. So it's information will be emailed out about that in due course. As many of you as possible. Yeah. Thanks very much indeed, everybody. Good night.